I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us today. My name is Daniela Sime. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work and Social Policy. I'm in the social policy part of the school. We have the social work part of the school. And today is our first session on the school seminar series. We have 4 main research clusters in the school, and what we agreed that the seminar series are distributed between the clusters. So keep an eye on our program. You're welcome to join the sessions. They will be advertised as widely as possible. Please invite others along as well. So today we have 2 speakers. Both Konstantina and Penny are PhD students in the school, so I'm delighted that they have offered to share their research with us. We will be recording the session and mainly the presentation part of the sessions. You will be all familiar with Zoom by now. We want to use the chat box for your questions as the 2 speakers present, but we agreed we're going to take questions at the end of the 2 presentations. So we're starting with Konstantina's presentation. Konstantina Karastoyanova, who's a PhD student in social work, she's looking at neuroendocrinology. And aspects of, you will see in, her presentation of how, the interesting research that's doing on this. So Konstantina first, and then Penny is presenting on the impact of parental alcohol misuse on adults. So 2 very exciting presentations today. We're going with Konstantina's first, and she's gonna screen share. Yeah, you okay to do that just now, Konstantina?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. I'm surprised that I can see so many of you today. Thank you for your time. My name is Konstantina, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Social Work and Social Policy. And what I'll be presenting to you today PhD thesis that is supervised by Professor Ian Greener and Professor Sir Harry Burns. Unfortunately, I did not manage to squeeze everything in what I usually do in my presentation, so hopefully you'll find this one interesting. So what I'll be talking to you today is the neuroendocrinology of adversity. And I'll start with poverty and the causes and the maintenance of it, which no doubt involve complex biological, economic, and sociocultural influences. However, however one conceives of the antecedents of poverty, there are very definite biological consequences. These are pictures from my hometown in Bulgaria. So you can see the level of deprivation there. So what is exactly the problem with poverty? Well, let me start with that there is an extensive research that links childhood poverty to higher or increased risk of psychopathology and physical illnesses in adulthood. Childhood poverty has also been proven to be a reliable predictor of adulthood socioeconomic status. Poverty has also been associated with impaired cognitive function and neurological activities, which means that children experiencing disadvantaged poverty or lower socioeconomic status frequently display decreased levels of cognitive functioning and neurological activity across numerous domains, with the severest effects being found in language function and regulating cognitive resources such as planning and attention. These deficits are frequently associated with unfortunate long-term effects, such as lower educational attainment, higher unemployment rates, and psychological factors such as low self-esteem and self-efficacy. And here comes the question is how we can explain this and what causes this. So one possible mechanism to explain these far-reaching effects of childhood poverty on health is chronic stress. with chronic exposure to stress associated with living in low-income families, having negative severe effects on physiological stress regulatory systems, eventually resulting in pathology. And growing evidence show us that being exposed to socioeconomic disadvantage, adversity, or chaotic circumstances produce long-lasting neurobiological changes, some of which we'll be looking at later on in this presentation, such as disruptions of the physiological architecture of the brain. So before we start with all the stress and toxic stress and what is destructive for us and what causes all these stress-related diseases, I want to note that there are different types of stress that we face as individuals during our daily life. And not all stress is noxious or destructive for us as organisms. There are the so-called positive and tolerable stress. With the positive stress, we refer the one that is short-lasting and that has moderate stress response, stress hormonal changes and increased heart rate in the face of a challenge or a stressor or a threat. Normal levels of positive stress appear to be fundamental for the development of a healthy individual. So when we talk about stress response, we can't really miss the main stress hormone, which is cortisol. Cortisol is a steroid hormone, also known as a glucocorticoid, and it's produced in the cortex of the adrenal glands in our kidneys. And it has many functions. So it has a function once we are exposed to stress, and it has a function whilst the body is in the so-called homeostasis or in balance. So the beneficial functions of this hormone whilst we are in homeostasis is that it influences our blood pressure, it controls the sea and water balance in the organism, it acts as anti-inflammatory. It helps and influences memory formation. Can you hear me? My internet is saying it's not stable. Is it everything okay?
It was breaking up a bit, but it's fine now.
Okay. So yes, it acts as anti-inflammatory. And probably the most important function of it is that it prevents the release of substances in the blood that are the cause of inflammation. This is all that happens during homeostasis, or when the organism is in balance and not exposed to stress. What the function of cortisol is when we are exposed to stress, we have the activation of the so-called stress physiological system. So imagine that. So this could be physiological stress or a psychological one. Physiological one, you might imagine axis, which causes the extra release of cortisol in the blood. The HPA axis comprise of three main interconnected and related areas in the brain. HPA axis stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So these three main areas in the organism are the hypothalamus in the brain, the thyroid gland, and the adrenal gland. So through this mechanism, we produce extra cortisol. We have this cortisol rush and adrenaline rush that helps us, in our particular situation, escape the lion. So during this time, what happens in the organism is every other system is suppressed. So we have a suppression of the immune system, suppression of the digestive system, reproductive system, and all other systems that don't seem to be vital in this particular situation, when all resources and energy needs to be directed in towards our survival and escaping this particular stressor. And this is all evolutionary adaptive, and it's a survival mechanism that we've developed during our evolution as organisms. But what happens when we are exposed to a continuous stress? What happens when we have this permanent lion in our life that causes us to be stressed? So what happens is we can see the implications of cannot switch off this APA axis activation and event which suppress or inhibit our growth. It inhibits our reproduction. It inhibits our digestion. It's immunosuppressive, and this way boosts inflammation. So this leads to all the stress-related diseases that we see in the literature, such as atherosclerosis, cancer, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, multiple psychopathologies such as schizophrenia, ADHD, altruism, etc., stuff that I already talked about. And then this is what happens. Rather than having positive stress, we end up having toxic stress in our lives. As you can see on this slide, systems that have been in because almost every cell in our organism has receptors for cortisol. So we have a distribution of cortisol everywhere, and it inhibits all these vital systems for our survival. So, as I already noted, low socioeconomic status has been associated with exposure to chronic stress. And this is because people who are experiencing disadvantage may frequently experience more detrimental stressors compared to individuals from higher socioeconomic statuses, which in general causes elevated levels of stress, more elevated compared to their counterparts. And this means, as argued by Kessler, that individual susceptibility to stress derives from their socioeconomic status. And we have one vicious circle where our low socioeconomic status individuals not only physiologically experience higher levels of stress, but they have implications for the cognitive appraisals of their events. So they perceive more events as stressful, as threatening compared to other socioeconomic status groups. So that seems to be the negative effects of being exposed to this toxic stress. Important here is that it's not poverty per se that causes all these negative implications. It's the unpredictability of events, it's the chaotic circumstances, it is this all this chronic stress that has been associated with living in deprivation that seems to be having negative effects on the development of the brain in infants, in children. So we can argue that excessive stress disrupts the architecture of the developing brain, as the literature shows us, with three main regions being identified: the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. Vital brain areas, and children lower socioeconomic circumstances associated with smaller amygdala. Amygdala is part of the brain that it's almond shaped, it's very small, and it's in the middle of your brain, and it's responsible for emotion regulations. So what we can see in children experiencing disadvantage or adverse childhood events is that they often have smaller amygdalas, and this results in a manifest of aggression and anxiety. What happens with the prefrontal cortex? That's a very, very important area that's responsible for attention, behavior, judgment, emotional responses, planning, higher intellectual activities, memory as well. So these are, again, very important centers. So smaller prefrontal cortex has always been associated with lower educational attainment, higher unemployment rates, and all the issues that we've seen earlier on, the long middle of the brain. It's responsible for memory formation. It's the main center where we develop the receptors of cortisol. So once we don't develop this area properly, it means that we can either end up being highly susceptible to stress or under evaluating risky situations in terms of and being higher on risk taking. This means slower and sluggisher response to stress, so slower to activate and slower to return back to homeostasis, which exposes us to continuous levels of elevated cortisol and the effects that we have seen earlier on in this presentation. As you can see, high cortisol level means lower cognitive function. Low cortisol levels mean lower cognitive functions. These are both children exposed to risk environments. What we're aiming for is moderate cortisol levels, exposing it to this normal positive levels of stress where we can find average cognitive function thriving. So as we've seen so far, adverse events lead to subsequent poor behavior in children, dysregulation of emotions and behavior, and long-term negative effects. What happens with the brain is, instead of developing normally, it develops this survival mode. So we don't have a healthy developed brain. Everything is transferred in this survival mode centers. And unfortunately, this has influenced biological and physiological systems. And this has been played out in lots of big cohort studies of childhood adversity, with one of the most famous, the Needham study, which has been researched. It started in the early 70s, where individuals were identified at the age of 3, and there was a subgroup that has been identified as and classified as of lower socioeconomic status or living in chaotic circumstances. And what happened is that what the researchers found is individuals were associated with having more criminal convictions, experienced teenage pregnancies, higher levels of unemployment, lower educational attainment. They were more likely to be substance abusers, something that maybe Penny will be talking about later on in her presentations. And all of them had higher cortisol levels. Most of them were in pre-diabetic stage, and by the time of the end of their life, when the study followed their life cycle, more health implications appeared as a result of the chaotic circumstances they lived in during their childhood. So how is my research related to all this that I was talking to you about today? Well, we've recruited male participants from 2 identified as higher socioeconomic and lower based on multiple indicators such as Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, unemployment rate, educational level, marital status, and many others. So what we did is we examined how what is people's endocrine reactivity to stress, and whether there are any dissimilar patterns in the reactivity between these 2 groups. And we did that by exposing them to a mild stressor, which was form filling that resembled the job seekers allowance form, because this is a stressor that individuals from lower socioeconomic status are frequently exposed to in their daily life. And our contribution of knowledge was not just in terms of reconciling the literature between the hormones, testosterone, cortisol, and poverty and disadvantage in general, but we also had methodological contribution, which is applying a comprehensive sampling protocol, which hasn't been applied or utilized in previous endocrine research. This is something that I'm not going to talk about to you today. So what we saw, and these are the results, we've had 30 individuals, 20 from higher socioeconomic status group and 10 from lower socioeconomic status group. They were equally allocated to either winning this competition or losing it. And what our results showed is that, first of all, losing had a higher impact, or it was of higher importance for the individuals from lower socioeconomic status group, and the endocrine response is displayed this particular sluggish and slow to activate cortisol response to the stressor, but also slower to return to homeostasis, which means that there was somehow of a disruption in their endocrine response to stress, based on the fact they had been exposed to continuous social defeat, or frequently resembled by living in poverty, structural violence, etc. So, as I already said, there was another hormone that we've investigated, testosterone, but we don't have the time to talk to you about it today. So this will be the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Her work on the impact of parental alcohol misuse on adult children. So you'll see how the two presentations come together really well, looking at issues of adversity and disadvantage. So Penny, you okay to start? You are on mute just now.
There we go. That's the unmute button. And now I don't know how to go back on the slide. This is terrible, isn't it? Right. So, hi everyone. My name's Penny. I've actually got the same supervisors as Konstantina. So I'm in the third year of my PhD, and I'm supervised by Professor Ian Greener and Professor Sir Harry Burns. At the moment, I've almost completed analysing my data, and I'm starting to write everything up. So I thought I'd talk a bit about where I am at the moment and what I found. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about what my study is about, who adult children of problem drinkers are, because it's quite wordy, protective factors and resilience, active agency, a good relationship with a supporting and trusting adult, cultural connection and identity, and where it's all going to go from them. So the active agency, a good relationship with a supportive and trusting adult, and cultural connection and identity are just 3 of the protective factors I've looked at. I've looked at 8, but I've got a list of about 25. So because it's just a short presentation, those are the ones I thought I'd discuss. So my study was looking at adult children aged between 30 and 55 who grew up in Glasgow. These individuals were self-identified as having been impacted by a parent's problem alcohol use. So their parents didn't have to be like diagnosed alcoholics or anything, but they had such a problem with alcohol that the children thought it was an impact on their lives growing up. So I interviewed, and these were narrative interviews, so they were quite open, 20 individuals, 11 of whom 11 didn't undertake problem substance use, and 9 of the individuals did. The individuals who undertook or were undertaking problem substance use, I found through recovery centres. So it was very clear which group individuals were being placed into then. And then I thematically analysed the interview transcripts using protective factors and trying to see which individuals had which protective factors out of sort of the 8 I was looking at. So I picked the 1980s to 2000s as individual childhoods. So that's when the people aged 30 to 55 were born, because there was an increase in alcoholism and social upheaval during that time. And as everyone knows, currently there's an issue with problem substance use, particularly in Glasgow. So, yeah. So just to explain who adult children of problem drinkers are, it's a phrase that came from Al-Anon, and they started a support group for family members impacted by alcohol use in 1951. So it's a common problem, but there's no sort of exact figures of how many adult children there are. It's estimated in the UK that about 3.4 million children grow up with parental alcohol misuse, but there's not really much information on the adults, so the children once they become adults. So in my study, these were individuals who self-identified as having a parent who had an alcohol problem. I've just sort of stolen the phrase adult children because it's quite hard to describe this group. But yeah, they're people like Janie Godley and Shiggy Bain from the book most recently. So Glaswegians, grew up in Glasgow. They're about the right age range as well. Okay. So this is a list stolen from Velman and Templeton, which lists the protective factors and resilience in children affected parental substance use. So there's a lot of protective factors there. Protective factors prevent the risk of negative impacts of, prevent the negative impact of risk factors. So in Velman and Templeton's sort of list, they're either individual factors, family factors, or community level influences that can help negate the risk of negative outcomes. Velman and Templeton's table quite nicely summarizes them. So I used this as a starting point, and I narrowed the factors down to 8 because it would take forever to go through them. And I picked the ones that were most prevalent in the literature as well. So they were internal locus of control, active agency, religion, and then a supporting, trusting relationship with an adult, close positive bond with an adult, and whether the primary caregiver has an alcohol use problem. And then the community factors were cultural connectedness and identity and community engagement. I also left my analysis open in case additional protective factors came up that didn't fit into any of the categories. But what I found at the moment is that hopelessness and suicide comes up a lot, but they're not protective factors. That's sort of the opposite, risk factors. Additionally, Velman and Templeton talk about resilience and how these protective factors can enhance resilience. So the way they describe resilience as is sort of something that can overlap with protective factors, but which is encouraged through protective factors. I know resilience has been kind of a contested term. So in my research, I focused a bit more on hope theory, but I haven't really gone into that in this presentation. But yeah, so I'm using hope theory instead of resilience, and hope theory is more of a goal-directed energy and the ability to accomplish your goals. So it's a bit more structured. Okay, so my first is agency, and active agency is actively seeking positive coping strategies. So in my study, I found that education, schooling, comics, and music were all active agency pathways that individuals used to try and deal with their circumstances. The people who did not undertake problem substance use did these a lot more, particularly education. They saw as a means for escape. So escape was mentioned frequently throughout my study. Individuals were trying to find ways to escape with their help-seeking behaviour. Unfortunately, in the problem substance use group, individuals sort of use the substances to escape. So this is a quote from one of my participants actually talking about how he tried to use comic books as a coping mechanism, but it didn't really work out. So I'll just read that. I suppose that was my coping mechanism. I found escape in comics. I think about it. I found escape in comics. I used to fantasize about being Wolverine. I used to fantasize about being Wolverine because of the comics, how much he could take, and he would always get up and do something. And I was like, I want to be like that guy. That's cool. Being able to heal from anything. I think that's where it was, just wanting to heal. But it wasn't happening for me. It wasn't happening for me. So I found solace in the bottom of the bottle. Yeah. So my next factor was a good relationship with a supporting and trusting adult. So this comes up in all the studies that a supporting and trusting adult can help individuals sort of turn their lives around. So this is a picture of the My World survey, which is actually on the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde website. They talk about this report because it finds that one good adult is very important to the mental well-being of young people, and that over 70% of young people reported that they received very high or high support from an adult in their study. And so one good adult had a positive impact on the child's self-belief, confidence, coping skills, and optimism about the future. I found that in my study as well. 9 out of the 11 individuals who didn't use substances had a supporting and trusting relationship with an adult, whereas only 4 out of the 9 problem substance use participants, well, who used substances, had no adult that fulfilled this role. And these adults could be people like teachers or parents or family members. But it was quite difficult. The people who use substances talked about how the teachers didn't necessarily care, or if the teachers did care, they didn't trust them enough to tell them about their problems. So that does link back to the literature on the topic. I had one participant he was a teacher, so he was a little bit biased, but it's a nice quote from him to sort of summarize the relationship. So but I will count the fact that some of my teachers were like this. You can change lives. And I think looking back, you know, as a teacher now, I think back to those 1 or 2 teachers who do push you and tell you and say you should do this, why are you not doing that, and type of thing. But I think you really need that kind of wider network and parental partnership and community partnership, where I think there is more now in Scotland. So he is talking about things getting better, and that in his mind, teachers are becoming more involved, which was quite interesting. So the last one I'm going to talk about is cultural connection and identity, which was my favourite area of my analysis, but it's got a lot to unpack that I haven't got around to quite yet. So there's loads about Glaswegian culture and identity. I actually went to the Glasgow Uni archives and looked at all the literature they've got on tenants, which was really interesting. So this is the Tenants Lovely Ladies campaign. And I think it sort of reflects views of masculinity and alcohol. There was a newspaper article published around the time that, I can't do a Scottish accent, but it's about putting your hands around them on the lovely ladies' pictures. So Walsh talks a lot about Glaswegians having a strong cultural identity and cultural connectedness. And there's like loads of other studies that found that Scottish cultural identity has been associated with the consumption of alcohol. And Scottish pubs are sort of considered men's domain, especially in the 80s. And alcohol was sort of considered a normal part of Scottish culture, especially in the Lancaster and Dudleyston paper. Drinking in Scotland has been accepted from the year dot is socially acceptable, it's just a way of life. They published in that. So it was quite interesting. I had loads of participants talking about drinking being a cultural issue in Glasgow, and the Glaswegian hard man. So this was quite interesting because this lady's father was Asian, but he wanted to identify as being Glaswegian, and she identified as being Glaswegian. So it was quite interesting. So my perception of it is that it's kind of a cultural thing, cultural drinking thing. Has been an influence on his relationship with alcohol because he does not see himself as an Asian man, he sees himself as a white Scottish man. So there's lots of issues around masculinity. A lot of my participants who were in the who had problem substance use talked about not wanting to be seen as weak, and alcohol and substances being a way so they could pretend that they weren't scared and sort of project this image. So that's where I'm at with the analysis really for those points. So from now, I've got to finish the PhD and continue this analysis. And me and Konstantina are looking at a way of linking our projects, especially as like a lot of my participants grew up in what could be termed chaotic circumstances. So their neuroendocrinology would be impacted in the way Konstantina's looking at. So it would be quite interesting to try and sort of create an intervention to help combat this, which would be sort of our next steps. Yeah, so that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Penny.